Hey there, quilting friends, and welcome to the cabin. It's me, Penny Tamikis at Cabin Quilters. Today's video, I want to tell you the top 10 items I think you absolutely need to get started quilting. A lot of beginners ask me this question. I'm newly retired. I want to start quilting. What are the things that you absolutely think I have to have in order to get started, to take a great class, and to just not be frustrated that I don't have the right stuff? So in today's video, I'm going to talk about those top 10 things that I think you absolutely need, every quilter should need, a couple of little cautionary tales, and at the end of this video, I'm going to tell you all the extra things that I think you might want to think about that are optional, but make great gifts for a new quilter. So if you're interested in that, stick around and let's see what I have come up with today. Hey quilters, I'm so glad you decided to stick around. So let's get started on those top 10 things I think every quilter should have. My number one item that I think every quilter should have on the list, well, that's going to be a good rotary mat. So what you see in front of you is an 18 by 24 inch self-healing rotary mat. This one happens to be by Olfa. What do I mean by self-healing? Well, let's take a look. You can see that this mat is triple layered. It's got a coated side with ruler on one side. It's got a solid surface on the other side, and there's this bit of spongy material right in between. Now, a good self-healing mat means that you can slice and cut on it with a rotary cutter. I've used this one hundreds of times. As you can see, there's very little markings left in the mat. And these last not forever, but for a really good long time. So I would highly recommend purchasing a good self-healing mat. And as far as the size of the mat, well, my recommendation is to have the biggest self-healing rotary mat that you can, one, afford, and two, that you can keep out on a flat surface. And what I mean by that is you cannot put these leaned up against a wall. They'll kind of twirl and bend a little bit, and they wind up actually warping, and they won't sit flat. So if you can leave this mat nice and flat, and you can buy a bigger one than this, I highly recommend doing that. But just remember, if you buy something bigger, you have to store it flat. So sometimes you can store it under a bed or something like that, but just keep that in mind. I would not go any smaller than this mat, and here is the reason why. Let's get a bolt of fabric out. Now, for beginners, this is a bolt of fabric, and I'm sure you've seen these in the quilting store. One side of the bolt is a fold, and the other side is selvage, which means the width of this fabric is folded completely in half. So the width of quilting fabric is somewhere between 44 and 45 inches. So when you fold it in half, you can see that it's pretty much the entire width of this mat. So you want to be able to have a mat that you can start rotary cutting at one end and cut all the way to the other end of the fabric without rolling off the mat, because rolling off the mat can damage your blade and can keep it from cutting properly. So you can see that my fabric actually fits on this mat, and the 18-inch width gives me the ability to cut a full half of a yard from this bolt. So that's why we recommend this size, and this is the best way to be able to strip cut like a champ. So my number two most important item for new quilters is going to be this. Now this guy is a rotary cutter, and he is the most amazing invention ever, and also the devil's spawn. So here's what you're looking for. This is an array of rotary cutters. So what we have here are three different sizes of rotary cutter. This one is a 28 millimeter, this one is a 45, and this one is a 60. They actually say it right there on the center nut. 45 millimeter rotary cutter is the absolute standard. So why do we have all of these? The smaller the pieces you cut, if you're cutting something with small templates, always going with a smaller rotary cutter is a better idea. It's just safer, and it helps to cut easier and smoother and cleaner, and it's just a good idea. The 60 millimeter, opposite of small pieces with a small rotary blade, big pieces with a big rotary blade. So if you have lots of layers of fabric, and you can see from the nut out, we have a good 1/2 inch, 3/4 of an inch to use to cut. So if you're cutting layers of batting or something like that, this is the guy that you need. But for beginning quilting, we're going to concentrate on our 45 millimeter rotary cutter. this is what you need. And there are a couple of cautionary tales that I have. When you purchase your 45mm rotary cutter, definitely get at least one extra blade. Every beginner, and actually a lot of experienced quilters, will run off the mat, get too close to a ruler, and nick a blade. And if you nick a blade, it just simply doesn't cut as smoothly as it should. They come in a variety of colors and sizes, all kinds of different brands. So when you're looking for one, you're going to want to look for one with a guard. Here is an example of a guard. If I'm going to cut, I'm going to pull this guard right back, use the rotary cutter, and immediately close the guard before I set it down. Now, why do we do that? I said these things are the devil's spawn, and if this blade can find your hand, it will. And I'm talking about not just beginner quilters, but experienced quilters alike. We have all nicked or cut ourselves on a blade, so you definitely do not want to get a rotary cutter without a guard. This one has a very obvious sliding guard. This rotary cutter has a little switch, so you can see the guard on the back. And if I click this switch, there you go, the guard goes back up in and then it comes right back down. Now here is a rotary cutter that I don't recommend, and it's not very often that I don't recommend products, but for a beginner, I'm going to show you this one. Now this is a great rotary cutter. It's a 45mm. It's from Fons & Porter, and I'm going to carefully show you why I don't recommend this one. Now this blade actually has a guard, but it's pressure sensitive. Can you see that? So if I press down on the blade, it cuts. And when I let go, the guard goes back. Now, that seems like a really great thing for a beginner, right? It keeps you from forgetting to close that blade. And I would say for an experienced quilter, this is a great rotary cutter to have, but for a newbie, sometimes it's really hard to see up against the ruler, and you don't recognize the fact that you're not near the edge of the ruler at all. But I do recommend testing out several different types. So if you're at a quilt store and they have a rotary cutter out, why don't you give that a shot? If you have a friend that has one, try it out, but make sure you get one with a blade. After you get your rotary cutter and your mat, you're definitely going to need some quilting rulers. So here are the two that absolutely, without a doubt, I would recommend. The first ruler I would recommend is getting yourself a 6 or 6.5 inch width by 24 inch ruler. Now, why do we want to do that? Well, let's go back to our bolt of fabric again. We definitely are going to be cutting strips in our sewing life, and we want to make sure that when we're cutting those strips that we have a ruler that is longer or wider than the actual fabric we're cutting. So you can see I've got a good inch and a half of clearance on both sides of this ruler when I set it down to cut my fabric. And that's exactly why you want something like this. 6 inches wide is a really good width for most borders and strip sets and things like that. So this one is definitely one that you're gonna need. The second ruler that I would highly recommend is a 12 inch by 12 inch square. This one happens to be by Creative Grids. Actually, both of these rulers happen to be by Creative Grids. It just happens to be my preferred method of ruler because this ruler has whole measurements on one side, but if you flip it around, it has half measurements. And all of Creative Grids regular rulers are like that. So I tend to buy these quite often. Now the other ruler that I love is OmniGrid. That one I can recommend. And also a lot of customers love Quilters Select, and shops are carrying those more and more these days. So why do you need a 12.5 inch ruler? Well, most blocks for beginners are going to be somewhere around 12.5 inches or less. And so a 12.5 inch ruler gives you the opportunity to square up around each of your blocks. So a good square ruler in a reasonable size that sort of encompasses all the blocks that you're going to make early on in your quilting career, that's good to have. Now, there's not a lot of point in measuring properly and cutting properly if you're not going to stitch properly. So my next item that I think every quilter should have, number 4, is a 1/4 inch piecing foot. The standard foot that every sewing machine is going to have is going to be about a 3/8 inch width foot. This is standard for just about everything in sewing and any kind of piecing you're going to do, but in quilting, most patterns call or are implied to use a 1/4 inch seam unless otherwise directed. So here is the difference between those 2 feet, this being the standard and this being the 1/4 inch. let's take a look at what their difference is. So right here in the center of the foot, there's a little line, and that's an indication that at a default setting, that's where your sewing machine needle is going to fall. So this foot should actually be 1/4 of an inch from the place of the needle to the edge on both sides. And that way, when you're sewing on both sides of that needle, you have a guide to run your fabric, and that's how you're going to get that perfect 1/4 inch seam allowance. If you did that with this foot, if we lay these feet right on top of one another, right at that line, you can see how much bigger that foot is than the other one. Now you may be thinking to yourself, well, it doesn't really matter. I'm sewing together some basic blocks and I haven't noticed a difference. And I guess if you're sewing something that doesn't have triangles or lots and lots of pieces, you know, the margin of error with those blocks might not be very noticeable, especially if you're sewing something like, triple strip or a 9 patch or a 4 patch, you can probably get away with it. But when you start adding triangles to the mix and perfect measurements and lots of different blocks, it can really wreak havoc with pretty much all of your piecing as well as your borders and bindings and things like that. So it's always good to have this 1/4 inch foot. If you're unsure of whether your machine comes with one, you can go to your sewing machine store, show them your feet, and they'll show you whether you have that one or not. Most machines you can order a foot, and they're usually sold by the shank. So there's aftermarket feet that you can add even to an older machine that'll work perfectly. So once you have all the measuring and sewing and cutting tools down, you're probably going to need a few things to help you get your seams aligned. And one of those things is pins. In general, quilting pins are going to be long and skinny. And here's an example of sort of a dime a dozen box of quilting pins. They're very long, very sharp. This one has a little plastic ball at the end. You can get pins in all shapes and sizes, meant for all types of different purposes. For quilting, I would recommend not getting something with a ball, but actually getting something with a flat head like this flathead flower pin. These things are very sharp, very long. This one happens to be a little bit bent, but they lay nice and flat. They don't have that little pop-up spot there, and they lay nice when you're trying to sew on your sewing machine. They don't add any additional puckers. Now, my favorite kind of pin, and this is just an opinion now, are these little pins here. They have magic pins. There's all kinds of different brands now. These happen to be magic pins. And these are also long and thin and sharp. And you can see this little end on this guy. Well, these pins have a plastic end, and if I actually need to take this over to my iron for any reason and I heat this up, this could melt and it could actually wreak havoc with my iron. These are actually a heat-resistant pin. They're made of some sort of heat-resistant silicone, and they're not going to melt. And they lay pretty flat. They also have some ridges on them, so they're pretty easy to grip, and they're just a really nice pin. And they make them in different types of sizes for different purposes, and also different brands. Once you're done picking the perfect type of pin for your choice that works for you, the other thing that you're going to need is something we all hate to use, and that's going to be a seam ripper. Now, seam rippers come in all shapes and sizes. Here's a few that I have. Here's one that pops out, so it closes up completely, and this is what it looks like. It has one sharp end and one ballpoint end. And this is for those unhappy days when you sew something incorrectly and you have to unsew it. This one folds right back up inside itself, and it stores in a pocket. Great for traveling to and from class. I highly recommend these. These are the newest ones that are out on the market that I know of, are the seam fixes, and they have a little cap. There's the seam ripper inside. They have a rubber tip and a rubber end on them, and you're probably thinking, what's that for? Well, when you cut through your threads, sometimes it leaves little tiny threads left over, and if you just take this and wipe this little rubber end on those threads, it tends to grip them and pull them right out, so it's just easier to clean up your mess after you're done sewing. There's also some really aggressive type seam rippers. This one just looks like you could cut somebody with it. It does work, but it also is cautionary tale. You can really put a hole in your fabric when you're using it, but a lot of people do like them. This little guy is the 4-in-1 tool. It's by Alex Anderson and C&T Publishing. And let me show you how handy this one is. So this one has a seam ripper right here on the end. perfect. And then the cap that goes back on actually has this angled end to it. It's great for holding things down near the iron or actually creating a finger press. The other side of this tool, you can see, has a different type of end. And on this end, we have a stiletto. And the stiletto is great for guiding pieces into your sewing machine, keeping your hand away from the needle at all times. And then when you put this little guy back on, well, it's kind of a sharp but not too sharp little pokey end for poking things inside, right side out when needed. So this one is a really handy tool, and this would make an excellent gift for a new quilter. Now you have some tools, you're ready for any accidents that might happen. What's the next item that you think you might need? Well, on my list, it is sewing machine needles. So you have to get yourself a good pack of needles. You know, accidents do happen, and with new quilters, oftentimes what happens is you get some thread breaks, you don't realize it, but in jostling your sewing machine to and from class, you can get a little nick in your needle. So having an extra handy pack of needles in case you need to change it. I'm going to say that 90% of all issues I have in beginner quilting class with people sewing on their machine is because they have a nick in the needle, and changing the needle usually solves that problem. So here I have two different types of needles. They're both by Schmetz, which is pretty much the standard in the sewing community. This needle right here is a universal needle, and almost everything that you need to do, you can do with a universal needle, and it will be a pretty good needle. As with anything that's universal, it does all of the jobs somewhat well. So if you have to and you can't decide what kind of fabric you want to sew on, you're popping back and forth from dressmaking to quilting, you can always get yourself universal needles and you should be okay. For quilting, it is always good to have the right tool for the right job. And so this needle right here is a Microtex Sharp. Now, it's just what it says. It's a sharp guy, and it's meant for piercing down through the fabric and coming back up without creating a really big hole. So this one is what I would highly recommend you get if you want to start quilting. But if you have these in your standard sewing machine now, you should be good to go. Friends, we're getting up there to item number 8. I can never do this. Item number 8. We have our needles now. What do we need? Well, I would highly recommend a good pair of scissors. And that's a good pair of scissors is one that you haven't used to cut paper. It's not in your kitchen drawer. It's only used for fabric and quilting. Of course, I'm going to show you my absolute favorite scissor on the market. And here you can see in 3 sizes. They make them in quite a few more sizes than that, but these are the 3 standard sizes I use most often. These scissors are by K Buckley. They have a very sharp point, as you can see. They're a serrated blade, and they're really good for pretty much everything you can do in quilting. Applique, clipping out paper, snipping threads. I use these quite often up near my cutting table, and in case I need to clip something with fabric. Sometimes I use them to cut batting pieces or cut any kind of stabilizer pieces that I need. So I use the bigger ones for that, and you can see sort of how they fit in my hand for size. These are the medium ones. Well, I don't know. I just thought it's good to have an array of sizes that you need. These guys usually sit over on my ironing station. And these little guys right here, well, they sit right next to me on the sewing machine. And they're an easy snip for those quick threads that I need to clip as I'm ending my chain piecing. But you definitely want a good pair of scissors that are just made for quilting. And if you want to, you can put little fobs on the ends of them, so that lets everybody know not to cut paper or anything else other than fabric. And if you do, I'll cut you. Number 9 on my list of things you should have is a good iron. What do I mean by a good iron? A good iron doesn't necessarily have to be an expensive iron. I actually use a Panasonic cordless iron for almost all things that I want to do. But I am a dry iron presser, no steam. Now, I always have an extra iron laying around in case I need to use something that requires steam, like Steam-A-Seam 2 or something like that, where I absolutely have to fill an iron with water. So I actually have an inexpensive Black & Decker that I think I bought at a big box store for probably $15, at least $20 or less. And I keep that up here in the sewing machine in the event I ever need to fill something with water. And I gotta tell you, there are lots of different irons on the market. There are high pressure steam irons. There are irons that lift themselves up and stay in a seated position. And all of them are great. If you love them, then you gotta buy what works for you and what works for your budget. But I have to tell you that I think those $20 irons work just as well, and especially if you don't drop them, I actually think the cheaper ones hold water a lot better than the more expensive ones. But that's just me. I have had Rowentas, Alissos, all kinds of different irons. I've settled on my Panasonic irons. I have about 3 of them because they're cordless. Everything rolls up into the unit. You can put a heat resistant cover on top of it and take it to and from class. So I tend to use those all the time. I also really don't like that cord and floating around on that cord. That brings me to ironing surfaces. All you need is a great ironing board. You can get a wide one, a narrow one. It doesn't really matter. One that sits on the table. As long as you have a good clean surface where you can lay your fabric. So if you're starching a lot of shirts on that ironing board, maybe you don't need an additional ironing board or additional iron. Just check and make sure that your iron is nice and clean, and maybe you could get a different cover for sewing and piecing so that everything stays nice and clean and you don't get a lot of residue. You definitely don't want to use an iron that your son's made a grilled cheese sandwich with. Just saying. Now we've come to the end, and my number 10th item that you need if you're going to start quilting is definitely going to be a decent tape measure. Here's a great tape measure that I bought years ago. I'm not really sure. I think this is a June Taylor brand. You can see on the front of it that it's actually meant for quilting. It's got a cute little quilt block, and it also says 120 inches. That's right. It pulls out forever and ever and ever. And why do I need a tape measure that goes to 120 inches long? This one has worked great. I've had this one for probably 20 years. Why do I need this? Well, I'm going to need something like this to measure the borders of my quilt. So when I lay my quilt out, I'm going to want to be able to have a tape measure go from one end of the quilt to the other end of the quilt so I can properly measure borders, I can properly measure binding, just anything and everything that I want to do, I'm going to need that. And 120 inches is about the max that quilts usually are. So that ought to do you. So if you're going to buy a good tape measure, you could probably get away with a 60 inch for a little while, but the second you build a quilt that's larger than 60 inches, you're going to need a bigger tape measure. So do yourself a favor, get yourself a good one. Like I said, this one, you would think that it would break after a while, but I think I've had this baby for about 20 years and it's still going strong. So that's it, guys. That is my top 10 items that I think every beginner quilter needs. But I did promise you that in addition to that, I would tell you a few of those optional items that I think are really great that you may maybe run across that you'd like to have. And most definitely, if you're the woman who has everything and somebody's always looking for gifts to get you for Christmas, birthday, Mother's Day, whatever, Easter, Hanukkah, whatever, if you need something like that, it's great to have a list of items that you'd love to have that might make your quilting life easy. So I've put together a short list of items that I think would be handy to have if your budget allows it, or if you want to ask for those as a gift. So let's go back to rulers for a moment, and here are a few of my favorite extra rulers that I think would be really handy to have. This one is a 6.5 inch square, and I know we already purchased a 12.5 inch square for our quilting, but you know, sometimes when you're working with 4 patches or 9 patches that are smaller, it's easier to square up or to line up our pieces in a much smaller ruler. So always having the tool for the job is great, and sometimes a 12-inch ruler can be a little unwieldy if you're working with a lot of small pieces all at once. So a 6.5 inch ruler is a great extra optional ruler to have around for those extra little pieces. As always, the 2.5 inch ruler, that's also a great one to have. 2.5 inch strips are a commonplace in the market. They even sell them pre-cuts with some fabric companies, but a lot of pattern designers design patterns around them, and so having a ruler that is exactly 2.5 inches wide, well, that is a handy thing to have. If you fold your fabric up, you can lay one edge of your fabric on this side of the ruler, cut on the other side of the ruler, and just like that, you have a bunch of 2.5 inch strips. This one is a 2.5 by 18 inch ruler. This one also is a Creative Grids, and this one is a favorite go-to of mine when I'm doing small strip piecing. Again, with small pieces, I tend to gravitate towards this guy. And why do I do that? Well, this guy is a 6-inch by 12-inch ruler. He's just like that big long ruler, he's just half the size. So if I'm working with fat quarters or something like that, this one is just really handy for me to cut a lot of pieces right away. Also, in my stash, I tend to keep my fabric on half bolts. This is what we're looking at. So if you see, here is the fold of the fabric and the selvage fold, and I folded it in half again and rolled it up on these handy little storage boards. So when I'm going to cut yardage out, this one fits perfectly on this distance. So this one is a good go-to ruler to have. Again, just a little bit smaller, a little less to wield when I'm trying to do my quick cutting. These are my 3 best options for additional rulers if you want to buy a few extra things but not go overboard. My other go-to extra item is a handy wool pressing mat, and these guys come in all kinds of sizes. This one is just slightly smaller than my recommended cutting mat. This is something that you can lay down on just about any table. Just keep in mind that what makes a wool pressing mat really great is that it absorbs steam and all of the extra starches and stabilizers that we put in. It actually sucks the steam down through, so in theory it helps get the wrinkles out of your fabric a lot easier. But because it does that, it can actually push moisture out the other side. So you just definitely want to be careful where you lay this guy. Don't put it down on your cutting mat, or so my friends tell me, because it can warp those things. But this one is really handy to have. I've said it in other videos. I'm a big fan of a wool pressing mat. I think it just does wonders for getting those creases out, especially if you're a dry iron presser like I am. If you don't use a lot of water or a lot of steam, this just helps give that heat a little bit more intensity so that you can press those wrinkles out easier. My next handy little tool, and it's so handy that I actually give it to each one of my retreaters that comes for a visit with me, and that is that purple thing. This tool, this one actually in particular, this very one, I have had for probably 20 years. So if you look at that purple thing, let me show you a few of its options. The first thing is the end of this is a square, and it is exactly 1/4 of an inch square. It is really great for testing your 1/4 inch seam. It's also great if you're putting a binding on and you're stopping right at the 1/4 inch. You can lay this right down on the edge of your binding and know exactly where to stop. This also has a little pokey end on it, so it can act like a stiletto and help feed fabric through the end of your under your foot and keep things nice and even and in line and keep your fingers away from the needle. The other thing this guy works for is a great pokey stick. So if you have to turn something right side out and you need to poke into the corners of an item, well, this one has a little bit of a pokey end, but it's not sharp, so it won't poke a hole through your items. And then the other thing it has here is this handy little slit. So let's say I'm feeding a piece of elastic through a waistband or something like that. I can actually put the elastic through this little slit and then feed this purple thing through my elastic casing and out the other side. Pretty handy. I mean, to have a tool that's that tiny that does so many things, it's pretty great. So I highly recommend picking one of these up too. So another great tool that I cannot recommend enough is this guy, a magnetic pin cushion. You can see why. So I can't tell you the number of times I've had a box of pins like this and accidentally bumped it, knocked it off the table, didn't see what was happening, or just was taking pins out. I was putting my binding on and taking pins out, or taking pins out of a strip set, setting them on the bed of my sewing machine, and they wind up all over the floor. And sometimes I would piece in my bare feet. So that can be a real danger. So I like to use these magnetic pin cushions. And really what the great part about these are, I have a ton of these. They're all over my studio. I have one on my cutting table in case I cut something and I want to line it up right there. I have one over on my ironing station, so when I'm ironing something, I can put pins in. It's a very long surface, so I like laying my borders out there. I have one sitting right in the throat of my sewing machine, so as I'm taking pins out, I can just drop them on there, and the magnet sort of sucks the pins right to the magnet holder. Also, I have one with a cover. I put these in my teaching boxes, and I take them to and from class as well, and to and from retreat. So these things can't be handier. They're not super expensive, and I have the old tomato and strawberry thing, and I have poked more needles through my finger picking that sucker up and moving it around my sewing room than I care to admit. So I prefer this guy right here, and this is a really handy gift to give yourself or to let somebody give to you. The next item that I think is probably one of life's greatest inventions, who knows where it came from, are these little guys. And they are called Wonder Clips for a reason. These handy little clips have made all the difference when working with bag projects, putting binding on. If you have a little bit of arthritis like me, just being able to squeeze them and put your binding on and not have to hold your binding down while you're stitching it with that, I call it my crab claw joint, has made all the difference in my arthritis. My last beginning quilting class, I had a student in there with dexterity issues, and she literally could not pin things together. So she used Wonder Clips exclusively. They come in all shapes and sizes and colors. Sometimes they come in a little box. It doesn't matter how you get them, but you should get yourself a few, because if you're ever working with anything other than pins, just in general, they work really well. I use them sometimes to clip parts together. If I'm in a class and I'm teaching something, and let's say I have 12 or 14 2.5-inch squares that are gonna go back in my box that I need to use when I get home, I will clip them together with a Wonder Clip so I don't lose them in my box. Because there's nothing more irritating than spending all this time cutting parts out for a quilt, and then you get back down to sewing, to finishing it, and you've lost one square. Absolutely awful. This will solve that problem. For beginner quilters and actually experienced quilters alike, there is nothing more irritating than getting to the end of a block and realizing it's the wrong size. And when you flip it over, you realize that your seams were either too narrow or too wide. So I would highly recommend getting yourself a great seam guide. Now this one doesn't have a brand on it. I'll try to show the brand in the description box, but it has tiny little holes on it that indicate where a needle position should be. So you can actually put your needle in the seam allowance that you're looking for, and then tape something to the side of your machine like washi tape or something like that, and test the 1/4-inch seam. You can also set it, this one has 1/2 inch, 3/8, 5/8, and 3/4. So if a bag pattern or something calls for a slightly bigger seam, you can measure it using one of these guys. The other thing that I found recently is this handy seam tape. Now this is made for diagonal piecing, but it kind of does exactly the same thing as this, testing that 1/4-inch seam. So I found this one on Amazon. It comes in a 2-roll pack, and it's just like washi tape. It's a very thin, very easily removable tape, and it has a red line down the center, which is where your needle position will be, a black line on one side and a blue line on the other side at exactly 1/4 of an inch. So you could lay this right on the front bed of your machine going into your needle with the red line right at your needle position, and from either side always know exactly where you're sewing. Now what it's designed to do is to be able to hold the seam down through the center of your diagonal block. So if you're sewing diagonally through a square, you're going to run the point of that square right through the red so that it hits right on the needle, and that allows you to have that perfect 1/4-inch on both sides. So another item I think it's really handy to have, and this one might cost you a little bit more, is a walking foot. So when you're all done piecing your brand new quilting project, you're going to want to quilt it. And if you don't quilt by check, which means hiring somebody else to do it, you're going to have to quilt it yourself. And that's going to require some sort of a special foot so that you don't get any gapping or puckering or anything untoward on the back side of your quilt. So a walking foot is actually a machine that walks up and down with your needle, and it actually moves the same way the feed dogs do on the underside of your machine. So in theory, it keeps all the layers passing through at the same time, rather than the presser foot pushing down and pushing in the opposite direction of the feed dogs on the bottom. So a walking foot is very, very handy to have. It's really handy to have when you're putting bindings on, especially. But for quilting those straight line quilts or even squiggle lines or whatever you're doing in a grid or whatever through your machine, this one is pretty handy. And most machines do have a walking foot that works with them. If it's an older machine, you're going to have to consult your local dealer, or even the internet might tell you, even Google. But most of them work with low shank, high shank, all those types of things. So you can find one that fits most machines. So I highly recommend you pick one of these up. They're usually, if I had to guess, maybe $50, $60, maybe cheaper, but right about that price point, depending on the type of machine you have. That brings me to my final item that I think every quilter should have when they begin quilting, and that is 100% free, and that is a can-do attitude. I have to tell you that it is an absolute joy to teach any quilter that comes in, no matter how many mistakes, no matter how many questions, no matter how much of a beginner they are. If they have a great attitude when they come into class, they are a joy to pass on all quilting knowledge to me. The sad quilter is the one that comes in with the attitude they can't do it. There's nothing you can do. I messed up and I just feel so bad about myself. I can't finish my project. And the thing is that quilting is like any other skill. You try it, you make some mistakes, you learn from those mistakes, and you get better. And practicing is what it's all about. So if you arrive into this field of quilting, no matter whether you're with a class, by yourself, on YouTube, it doesn't really matter. If you have a can-do attitude, that is just about the best tool you can have in quilting. I'm really glad that you stuck around for the whole video. I'm so pleased that you're enjoying the content we're putting here on the channel. If you like this video, hit the thumbs up. Tell YouTube that you love this channel. You can always hit the notification bell to be notified of new things. And, you know, if you're watching and you're not a subscriber, think about subscribing. You know, it helps support the channel and it helps make it even more easy for me to make all these wonderful videos for you each week. So thanks so much for sticking around. Go out, buy yourself some new stuff, and happy quilting, guys.